So I got my first DevOps job in it was around 2008. But at the time, I didn't even know what the hell DevOps was. And to understand how I got to that point, we got to kind of go way back in time to how I first got started into technology. So if we go back to the mid 90s, I was working as a telephone installer at the time. So we would go to businesses and run all the cables, install telephone systems, and program the telephone system, that kind of thing. But networking in small businesses was starting to get popular, so we were there pulling cables anyway. So we're like, hey, we can pull the network cables for you too. And so we started doing that, which led to the customer saying, hey, you guys pulled all of these network cables, but they don't really do anything for us. So then we expanded our offering and started installing network switches and configuring those. And most people didn't have internet at the time, or if they did, it was through a dial-up modem. So we did that, and then they would call us and say, the networking thing is done, but John can't print to Sally's printer. I'd be like, did you tell John's computer to use her printer? I click the print button. So then we started doing a little more, configuring the computers on the network, and kind of stopped it at that point right there. Didn't go too much further into that until I got to this one client. And same thing, I installed the telephone system, programmed it, ran all the cabling, installed the switches, hooked the computers up, and they're like, hey, we got these server things that we need to get them installed, and then once they're installed, we've got a guy who will log into them remotely and configure those for us to get us up and running. I'm like, okay, cool. So I installed all the servers, put all the hardware in there, installed the operating system, got it set up so that this dude could dial in from wherever he was and access it remotely. And that was kind of the end of that, or so I thought. Was back on that customer site later, and they're like, man, we're just having tons of problems with our database. It's like, can you take a look at it? I said, nah, it's way outside the scope of what we do as a company. And they said, well, what if we hired you? And I said, well, what exactly would that look like, And so let me kind of set the stage for what my life was like at the time. I was living in a trailer house in Kentucky, and my vehicle was a 69 GMC pickup that the bed had fallen off of. Literally, the bed rusted out so bad that when I was driving down the road one day, it just fell. So there was also no floorboard in this truck. The floorboard was rusted out. And when you were driving, you could look down, and see the road down below you. And as cool as that sounds, there was really a downside, because whenever I would use the clutch, if I pushed the clutch in past where the floorboard should have been, it screwed up the linkage and the clutch would stick down there. So I would have to coast off to the side and then crawl underneath the truck, free up the linkage before I could keep going on my way. So that's kind of what my life was like. And these guys were like, well, what if we hired you? And they ended up offering me, I think it was like $40,000 a year to come to work for them. And that was just an incomprehensible amount of money for me at the time, because my trailer house and my truck both combined weren't worth that much. And in my head, my inner voice is going, damn, I don't even know if I can spell SQL, much less fix one. And at the same time, I hear my outer voice saying, yeah, let's do that. It's like, oh, all right, here we go. Now, because I installed the servers, I knew that they had the SQL Server manual there with them, because this was back at a time whenever you bought software, you got a bunch of 3.5-inch floppy disks and a big mammoth book to go with your software. So I left there with the book and turned in my 2-week notice, and every night over the next 2 weeks, I read this book from cover to cover. It was like 600 pages. And not gonna lie, like a vast majority of that book was way, way over my head. But went and took the job anyway, started working there, and got a hold of the guy who did the remote installation whenever I first set them up. And that's when I learned that they didn't really have a database problem. The problem that they had was there were bugs in the software that this guy built for them, but they still owed him like $30,000. And he said, I'm not fixing the bugs until you pay for what I've already done. So now, I don't know if you're a movie buff or not, but there's this thing called foreshadowing. Yeah. So some period of time went by, I continued working there, got home one day, and my wife was just in tears. I was like, what the hell's going on? Well, it turns out, much to my surprise, that my paycheck had bounced, which meant that the payment on our trailer house had bounced, and the payment for our electric bill bounced, and the telephone bill bounced, and then the bank charged all these overdraft fees because we had bounced these checks, which caused more stuff to bounce, and just goes on from there, right? So I go into work the next day, and I'm like, man, y'all aren't going to believe what happened. Right. So I explained it all to them. They're like, wow, we just learned that there was a problem transferring the money from our business account to the payroll account, and that screwed everything up. So we're going to fix it, and everything's going to be good to go. I'm like, all right, cool. So I went back to work. Well, some period of time went by, and the same thing happened again. Got the same story, same resolution. But this time I ended it saying, I can't let this happen again. I hope you understand that. And they're like, nope, totally understand, never going to happen again. Until it did happen again. This time I was at work, and my wife called me. She'd been at the grocery store trying to buy groceries and couldn't pay for the groceries because our account was overdrawn again. So she had to go back through the grocery store, putting all the groceries that she had in her cart away. And I kind of decided I'd had enough of this at that point. So I shut down all the services running on the servers. I changed the administrative logins for the servers, powered down the servers, and then put a boot password on them so that they wouldn't even boot up. And I still remember to this day, walking down the hallway on my way out, hearing people clanking on keyboards. Some of them were like, dude, something's wrong with the network. I was like, yeah. Funny, because something's wrong with my bank account too. So the network's kind of going to stay that way as long as my bank account stays that way. And well, by the way, you might want to call your bank because I'm probably not the only one in this position. So the key takeaway there is a lot of people like working for startups, and I've based most of my career around startups. Two takeaways actually. One, startups are cool. Choose your startups wisely though. You know, whenever you're interviewing with someone, you are interviewing them just as much as they are interviewing you. And your livelihood depends on you doing a good job interviewing, which I clearly did not. The second part of that is don't be afraid to do stupid shit. You know, I had no foundation or no skills or any reason at all to believe that I should have accepted that job offer, but I did. And while that particular job didn't work out, it set the stage for future things to work out. So now I was unemployed, so I went back to doing telephone work because I had to get money coming in. I knew I could do that, and I thought, man, there's no way in hell someone's going to hire me for a computer job when the only experience I have in that field, those references probably aren't going to be real favorable. You know what I'm saying? But I kept interviewing for computer jobs. So eventually I landed an interview with a company and was there for the in-person interview, talking to the manager. He's like, yeah, we got this database problem. Oh, okay. But actually it turned out this time to be like a real database problem, not a financial database problem of not paying your vendors. And we talked about it for a little bit, and I'm like, can we just go take a look at the server? And so get up from the middle of the interview, go into the server room, and he logs me into it. And I had a pretty good idea what was wrong with this server. So I checked some configuration things. Sure enough, I saw what I was looking for, and I'm like, look, I'm going to change this. We'll reboot the server, and I think you're going to be just fine. And so we did it, went back out, finished up the interview, and I walked out of there thinking, man, you are one dumb son of a bitch. They were trying to hire you, but you just fixed the thing that they thought they needed someone to hire for. So I thought I, interviewed my way out of a job there. A couple days goes by and the manager calls me. He's like, hey, so that server has actually been rock solid since you made that change. And I know we were hiring for someone to manage that full time. That doesn't look like that's really needed, but we would like to hire you anyway because we were just kind of impressed. I was like, all right, well, let's do that then. So that's how I ended up with my first sysadmin job. And this was it was completely a Windows environment. Windows NT for domains, I think was what it was called. It's been so long ago. But anyway, it was Windows servers, Windows workstations, all that kind of stuff. But over time, I started getting interested in two things. One was Linux. So as I learned about Linux, I started replacing Windows servers there with Linux servers, and then also got into programming, learning how to write code in .NET 1.0. Well, both of those led to my next job, where I interviewed for another company. It was a company that was just a few years old, so they were still technically in the startup phase, although back then they were just called new businesses. They weren't called startups. They didn't get a glamorous name. And so I started working for them, and this company ran sports camps for kids, and the COO was an ex-homicide detective. And this guy was just absolutely paranoid about protecting our data. Rightly so, right? Because we had the names, addresses, and pictures, and family members of these kids, as well as we had a list of where they were going to be when they were away from their parents at our sports camps and who was authorized to pick them up. So it was a legitimate concern, right? So I learned about this thing called intrusion detection systems, and I started building one for them. And I spent the next couple of years just building, maintaining, and updating this intrusion detection system to make sure that we never got hacked. And to the best of my knowledge, we never did. And so from there, I went to this other company that made military and police training videos. So at the time, they were primarily VHS based. So if you don't know what VHS is, that's this like great big plastic tape thing that would play movies. So for military and law enforcement personnel, if they needed to go to training about, someone doing suicide by cop, we had a video for that. We would ship them the videotape and they would watch it. But they wanted to move that to the internet. We're like at 2001, 2002, somewhere in that time frame at this point. So the internet's, getting commercial applications starting to grow. And so they wanted to convert from doing these VHS-based trainings to doing online-based training. And so I was leading that up for them. And they ended up getting acquired by a company that used civilian contractors for military contracts, right? And they may have misrepresented exactly what capabilities we had whenever they were proposing to sell this company. Because then the new owners started asking questions, and I was like, man, something's not right here. So I jumped ship and went to a different company. And it turns out I was right on that. My gut instinct was right. I was like, man, I've been down this road. I know where this is going. I don't want to be here when this happens. And sometime later at my new job that was just across the street, a friend of mine who was still working at the old place, she called me up and was like, hey, go look out the window towards our office. Go out there and there's 4 black Suburbans pulled up in front of it. She's like, yeah, those 4 Suburbans just pulled up. These guys got out, asked us where the server room is. They went into the server room, just ripped all the servers out of the racks, didn't even bother to unplug them or power them off, just ripped them out, threw them in the back of these Suburbans and drove away. And so that was kind of the end of that company. But I was over at this new company that was, they were several years old. They were just exiting the startup phase and into the adulting phase of business, for lack of a better term. And it was in the medical industry. So we had patient images and patient data across data centers in Europe, Australia, and the US. And we had thousands upon thousands of VPN connections between those data centers and between our remote partners and hospitals across the US. And this was 100% Linux based. And this actually is where I got my first taste of DevOps, although I didn't know what DevOps was. The thing about this one was whenever we had an outage, there were actual patients in emergency rooms and trauma centers across the US who couldn't receive life-saving emergency care because our shit was broken. So the pressure to get things back up and running was pretty high. And so I started to really focus on why things went down. And one of the things that, if you've done this for very long, or if you've done any research on this, deployments are one of the big reasons why things go down. And that was the case for us too. Now, when I worked primarily on the sysadmin side, it was just assumed knowledge that the developers were a bunch of dumbasses who couldn't write code. But I wasn't really happy with that answer. So I got to know those guys and I talked to my boss. I'm like, hey, let me go spend time with those guys and figure out what's going on. So I got to go spend time with them, got to know them on a personal level, as well as on a business level, and gradually came to realize that they're not dumbasses. So there must be something else wrong. And I just started asking questions, and started inviting myself to their meetings and would ask them, after a bad deployment, why did you guys do that? And it turned out in a lot of the cases, the reason that deployments went bad were because they had made assumptions or had been given information that wasn't accurate. So they did what they thought was right, but they were acting on invalid or bad information. So by hanging out and spending time with them more, I learned what they were doing before it turned into a production deployment, and could either, validate in areas where I didn't know what the impact would be or know what the assumption was, or if it was some of the areas I had experience in, could offer feedback and, help steer the product in the right direction for our environment. And the end result was it ended up, not causing outages whenever we did deployments, which is a lot of what DevOps is about. Although at the time I didn't even know, this was in 2008, I didn't even know what DevOps was. I don't even know if it was a thing back then. I don't know when DevOps really became an official term. But they got bought out and acquired. So I went on to my next company. And this one, the stakes for an incident were very similar, not in terms of patient lives being at stake, but being in terms of monetary value. It cost us millions of dollars whenever a system was down. And I was in a joint SRE DevOps type role where we were the escalation point for all applications. And this was a huge company. So my team was responsible for something like 200 custom home-built applications. And we were just the escalation resource. So whenever an outage happened, we got the call, we went in, we fixed it, and then we went back to figure out what went wrong and how to prevent it from happening again. And I learned the same thing. A lot of times it's just communication. Someone changes something or makes an assumption, and the other side either doesn't know about it, or the assumptions that were the driving factor for that change weren't correct assumptions. Now, both of those companies combined taught me 90% of what I know about incident management, because in one place, in one instance, people could die from an outage. In the other one, it was just millions of dollars that would be a business loss whenever an outage happened. And so I learned how to manage incidents really, really well. And it's not, a large part of incident management is not fixing the technical problem. Again, it comes back to communication. It's about communicating what you're doing, what the impact is, and when to expect the next line of communication. So from there, I went to another early stage startup. This one again was in the medical industry, very similar to the other medical company I had worked for, combined with a lot of the features from my first entry into the tech career, you know, the part about the whole bouncing paychecks things. But fortunately by this time, I'd matured and learned a thing or two and identified that early on before it caused me any impact. And so bounced out of that one relatively quickly. But at the same time, I was realizing I really enjoyed doing startups, but I also really enjoyed feeding my family, and there didn't appear to be a large overlap between those two. So I had to come up with something different. And so that's whenever I met some guys who advised me to start making videos. And this was whenever I started making videos for egghead.io and Pluralsight. And then some years later, I made some for Pact Publishing. But the creation of those videos on tech topics created royalties, and it created an alternate revenue stream for me. So now I had multiple sources of revenue so that I could continue to pursue the startups that I loved without being financially devastated or unable to provide for my family if that startup didn't work out, or I had to bounce out of that startup early for whatever reason. But by this point, I'd finally learned what DevOps was and knew that that's what my actual job title was, and had a pretty good idea of what the job description was. There were some sysadmin parts to it, there were some programming parts to it, but primarily what it was is there's this gap between having the code on the developer's workstation and getting that code into production. And DevOps is the thing in between those two. And it can be technical, it can be code, it can be infrastructure, it can be communication, it can be process, it can be any of and all of those things, and it'll be different at every one. And that's what keeps it exciting for me, is you get to be really, really creative, at the same time really, really technical. And because there are humans involved, it's going to be different every time, right? The technology is not the problem. Everything goes fine up until you put a human in the mix. And when you put a human in there, it's going to get all fucked up. That's just what we do. For 40,000 years, we have perfected that skill. And so that's what DevOps is like figuring out what the humans in this automated environment are trying to do, and then helping them do that in a more efficient manner without messing something up along the way. And so all of that just kind of set the stage to bring me to where I'm at today, where I just do my own consulting thing, and then I have different clients that I work for, and I get to interact with all these really great people in these different domains, solving really cool problems, and get paid really, really well for it. So my advice to you, what can I tell you that's going to help you get started in your career? And I think the one thing that has been consistent for me across all of my different jobs is just, saying yes to things that I probably didn't have any business saying yes to. I would agree to do things that I thought were interesting or cool that I didn't really know how to do, but I got in there and then I just figured it out. And I think that's probably one of the key takeaways here, is if you throw yourself out of your comfort zone, then you'll actually end up really surprising yourself at what you're capable of doing without knowing that you were capable of that. And the only way to do that is to throw yourself out there. It's a lot like riding a bicycle. When you first learned how to ride a bicycle, you didn't know what the hell you were doing. So you would try and you would fall and you would get scraped up and bruised a little bit. Then you would try again, and eventually you mastered it. And before long, you were raiding your dad's garage looking for scrap lumber and bricks to build a ramp, and you were jumping off ramps. And then you would have your buddies laying at the end of the ramp and you would jump off the ramp over your buddies. And it's kind of the same thing with your career, you know? Build some ramps in your career, because there's literally no downside. There is absolutely no downside at all to trying to do something. You'll either succeed or you'll get fired. And the thing about getting fired is you were looking for a job when you found this one, right? So you've got that part knocked out, and you're going to walk away from this job that you got fired from with a checklist. They're going to tell you, hey, you can't do skill X or whatever. And so you'll walk away with a checklist of things that you need to improve on for next time. So even if you get fired, that's still success in itself, because you've learned what you need to know for the next round. I think the other big takeaway for me is to encourage you not to rely on external validation. I talk to a lot of people who say, oh, I don't have this certification or that certification, or I need to get this certification, or I didn't go to this school. And all of that's external validation, and it doesn't mean shit, right? If you are looking for external validation to prove that you're qualified to start doing something, you're never going to be satisfied. You're going to get that certification, and then you're going to see that there's a level 2 certification right after that, and then a level 3 certification after that. And it's this never-ending process of preparing to get started. Don't wait, just start, just do it. And I say that as a person who, whenever I got started in the tech industry, it was absolutely a requirement that you had a college degree. And I've never been to college. I don't have a degree even to this day. And so the only time I was ever at a college was for a wild raging party where I got arrested for drunk and disorderly. So on a job application, it says, did you attend college? Yes, I did. Where'd you attend college at? University of Washington. And as messed up as that sounds, I mean, it's true. I did attend the University of Washington for a raging keg party. But they didn't ask why I attended the college. They just asked, did you attend the college? Maybe the last thing that I want to say about this whole journey is you're always training. You know, just like a professional athlete, once you win the Super Bowl, you're not done, you know. Maybe take a little bit of time off, but then you're right back in the gym or on the field or whatever your training facility is, getting ready for the next one. And the same is true with your career. You know, you land that job, you're not done now. You're not ready to coast and make it on easy street. You immediately start training for the next job. And that may be with the same company. It may be with a different company. The point is you're training and increasing and improving your skills, always getting ready for the next challenge. And that's just kind of life as it is. We're never done until we're done. After that, I got no advice for you. I don't know. So I guess in summary, that's it. Say yes to stupid things even that you're not ready for, that you don't think you're ready for, because you're probably more ready than you think you are. Don't wait to be invited. Invite yourself. Validation comes from within, so do things that make you feel, take actions, do actions that make you feel validated. Don't rely on external validation for who you are as a person. And wake up every day with 2 goals. 1 is to do the job that you were hired to do today, and 2, train for the job that you're going to be doing tomorrow.